Erik was the Alpha King of the North, a man carved from iron and winter, ruling a keep where warmth was a weakness and mercy was a rumor. She was sent to him not as a bride, but as a tool, a Weaver-scribe from the south, traded like a coin to seal a treaty between two worlds that had never trusted each other. She arrived with nothing but a wooden box of thread and the quiet dignity of a woman who had already decided she would not be broken. But she carried something no one had bargained for, a secret woven into every sigil she pressed into his stone walls, a power that made his ancient keep respond to her in ways that defied every law his pack had ever written. Then the arrows came. The locked rooms, the whispers of conspiracy closing in from every shadow. And the man who had called her a tool, nothing more, stood between her and the darkness and bled for it. So why did he kneel before the entire pack and say her name like it was the only word that mattered? Let's find out together. Keep watching. The horses left before she could say goodbye. Frida heard the gate creak shut behind the last of Veldoria's escort, iron on iron, final as a verdict, and did not turn around. There was no point. The courtyard of Ironveil Keep stretched before her in morning fog, stones the color of old bone, and she stood at the center of it with her wooden box of tools pressed against her chest, and the wind pulling strands of copper hair across her face. No fanfare, no greeting party, just stone and cold and the distant sound of wolves somewhere in the peaks. She had prepared herself for indifference. She had not quite prepared herself for how absolute it would be. The man who came to collect her was not the Alpha King. He was younger, broad-shouldered, with the restless energy of someone accustomed to moving, and now deliberately still. His eyes swept over her with the practiced efficiency of a soldier cataloging a supply shipment. Weight, condition, utility. When they landed on the wooden box she carried, something sharpened briefly in his expression, before going flat again. "Finn," he said, as though introducing himself were mildly inconvenient. "Second in command. You'll follow me." Frida followed him. The keep swallowed them whole. Stone corridors, low-ceilinged and smoke-stained, torches burning yellow in the gray light. She cataloged details the way she had been trained to: surfaces, textures, how the cold moved through the halls in currents. The walls were thick enough to hold winter out for months. The floor stones were worn smooth in the center of each corridor from decades of boots. Whoever had built this place had built it to endure. She was still looking at the floor when Finn stopped in front of a set of double doors, 3 times her height, banded in black iron. "Your first task," he said without preamble. "The main gate, the east corridor doors, and the great hall entrance. All need protection weavings before the first hard frost." She looked at the doors, then at him. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. A pause. Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Good morning," he said, with the careful enunciation of a man repeating a phrase in an unfamiliar language. "The pack has been experiencing incursions along the northern perimeter. The Alpha requires the keep's defenses reinforced before..." "Before what?" Another pause, longer. "Before he requires it." Frida looked at the doors again. They were old, centuries old, she thought. The iron oxidized to that particular darkness that only comes from age and salt air. The wood beneath was black oak, faintly grooved where previous weavings had been set into the grain and then faded. She set her box down, unlatched it, and began to take out her tools. "I'll need the measurements," she said, "and a source of warm water if there is one. The thread adheres better when the stone is warm." Finn blinked. Then, unexpectedly, "I'll send someone." She was already kneeling to measure the door's width. The morning passed in the language she knew best: texture and geometry, the weight of thread between her fingers, the faint resistance of old stone accepting new work. Weaver-scribes from Veldoria were trained for 7 years before they were permitted to set a single protection sigil, and Frida had spent 10 of them. The extra 3 because her mother had insisted on perfection, and her mother had been right. The symbols she wove into the threshold cloth were old ones, warding against cold iron, against hostile intent, against the specific malice that followed armies into civilian spaces. She had memorized their shapes before she could read common script. Her fingers moved through the pattern without her needing to think about it, and this was precisely the problem. It left too much of her mind free to think about other things, like the fact that she was alone in a hallway that smelled of old smoke and wolf, like the fact that no one had asked her name. She was pressing the corner sigil into a gap between two stones when she heard the footsteps. Two sets, heavy, deliberate, coming from the far end of the east corridor. They stopped just around the curve, not quite in view, but close enough that their voices reached her through the still air with uncomfortable clarity. The first voice she recognized, Finn's, low and careful. "She seems not as I expected. The weaving work is real." The second voice she did not recognize, and yet something in it, some quality of absolute unhurried certainty, made her hands stop moving. That's why she was chosen. The unhurried kind. That meant the speaker was accustomed to pauses obeying him. The weavings of Valdoria are stronger than any stone wall. She is a tool, more useful than the standard dowry, but no different in nature. Finn's voice, quieter. And if the bond, there will be no bond. The certainty again, harder now, with something under it that she couldn't name. "I don't have a mate. I have a treaty." Footsteps, receding, then silence. Frida looked at her hands. They were still holding the thread. She had not dropped it, had not made a sound, had not moved an inch. The sigil she had been pressing into the stone was half finished, the exposed thread hanging loose over the edge of the fabric. Slowly, with great deliberateness, she pressed it flat and held it while the adhesive set. Her fingers were entirely steady. The thread was slightly the wrong tension. She redid the last 3 knots. A tool. More useful than the standard dowry, but no different in nature. She had suspected this, of course. She was not naive, but there is a particular quality to hearing a thing confirmed in a voice that doesn't bother to modulate for the possibility of being overheard, a flatness to it, a lack of care, that is different from suspecting. That lands differently in the chest. She finished the east corridor's threshold weaving as the light through the high windows shifted from gray to pale gold. Then she packed her tools, stood, and looked at the completed work. The protection cloth lay flat against the stone, its sigils invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. She had woven 3 layers instead of the standard 2. The third was a tracing ward, which would alert the wearer of its paired token if the main weaving was tampered with or torn. She had not been asked for the tracing ward. She had included it anyway. Before she moved to the next door, she reached under her collar and unhooked the silver chain bearing her family's crest, a loom between 2 olive branches, and held it in her palm for a long moment. The metal was warm from her skin. Then she folded it into the corner of her wooden box, beneath a panel of uncut thread, and closed the lid. If she was a tool, she would be the sharpest thing in this keep. And when her work was done, when she had fulfilled every letter of the treaty, reinforced every door, warded every threshold, she would find her own way home. She had gotten very good at finding her own way. She saw him for the first time as she was finishing the great hall entrance, just before the last light left. She heard him first, actually. Or rather, she heard the absence of sound that preceded him, the way the 2 guards at the far end of the hall straightened without being told, and the faint creak of armor that wasn't quite armor, more like the compound quality of a person accustomed to moving as though they owned the floor beneath their feet. She was on her knees, pressing the final sigil into the base of the great doors, and she did not look up. The footsteps stopped. She could feel his attention the way you feel the sun shift. Not warmth exactly, but a change in the quality of the air. A stillness that was not absence but presence, very deliberate. The protection weaving beneath her hands gave off the faintest luminescence. It always did. Briefly, when it encountered a source of significant energy. She had seen it respond to thunderstorms and to the old wards at Valdoria's border towers. She had never seen it respond to a person. But it did now. A thin ribbon of silver-blue light, barely visible, running through the thread where the cloth faced the door. She pressed it flat. The light faded. The footsteps continued, past her without a word. She stayed on her knees for a moment after the sounds receded, her hands flat against the finished weaving, and catalogued what she had and had not seen in the half-second she'd had to observe. Tall, dark clothing, the particular ease of movement that comes from a body that has never doubted its own capability. A face she hadn't looked at because she had made a deliberate choice not to. She was very good at not looking at things that would complicate her plans. The night brought Sarah to a meeting Frida did not know was happening. She was 3 rooms away, working by candlelight on the next day's thread preparations, when her maid slipped down a back staircase to a candlelit room where a woman sat like a coiled spring, wearing Valdoria silk in a northern keep and not caring who noticed the contradiction. Frida would not know about this for some time. What she knew, in that moment, was the cold press of the stone floor through her dress, and the thread between her fingers, and the particular silence of a place that belongs to someone else. A silence with teeth in it, quiet but aware. She knotted the last preparation thread and blew out the candle. In the dark, she counted the doors between her room and the nearest exit. 12. She had counted them on the way in. Old habit. Her mother had called it anxiety. Frida had decided, somewhere around the age of 14, to call it preparedness instead. 3 days into her work, Sarah brought her the rumor like a gift. "There's a library," she said, setting down the morning tray with the particular brightness of someone who has decided to be helpful. "The old wing. Finn mentioned it. There are supposed to be books of Valdoria's oldest warding scripts there, from when the pact between the South and the North was first written." Frida looked up from the section of threshold cloth she was remeasuring. "Scripts from the founding period?" "That's what he said." Sarah smiled, warm and guileless. "I thought, for the outer wall wards, the advanced ones you mentioned needing, it might be useful." Frida considered this. The outer wall work was genuinely demanding. She had been puzzling over the appropriate layering sequence for 2 days, knowing that standard Valdoria methods might not account for the particular quality of northern stone, which was limestone over granite, with different resonance properties than the sandstone at home. "Where is it?" she asked. "I'll show you." The west wing announced its abandonment before they reached it. Frida noticed it in layers. The smell first, that particular cold mineral stillness of a room that has not had warm air moved through it in a long time. Then the floor, grit and dust undisturbed, except for one set of footprints leading in and not back out, very old. Then the light, which had the particular quality of light that has been bouncing off cold stone for decades without anything warm to land on. "It's just through here," Sarah said, and opened a door. The room beyond was a library, in the way that a skeleton is a person. The structure was there, the shelves, the high narrow windows, what had once been order and purpose. But it had been decades since anyone had sat in those chairs, and the cold that came out of it was a different kind of cold than the hallways. Not wind cold, but still cold, the cold of things that have been waiting a very long time. Frida stepped in. The shelves were real. There were books there, actual books, wrapped in protective cloth that had mostly held. Her hands moved toward the nearest shelf, before her mind caught up with her body. The door clicked shut behind her. She turned. The latch was on the outside. She put her hand on it anyway, the flat of her palm against the wood, and felt the particular solidity of something held from without. She did not call out immediately. She stood very still and let herself understand the situation, which took approximately 4 seconds. Then she turned back to the room and began to think about it practically. She was a Weaver-scribe. She had thread. The problem was temperature. The room's walls were exterior stone. She could feel the cold radiating off them, visceral and determined. She had perhaps 2 hours before her core temperature began dropping in ways that would compromise her ability to think clearly. She used the first hour to build herself the best approximation of a shelter she could from what was available. 4 of the heaviest cloth-wrapped book bundles, her own outer cloak, and approximately 6 yards of unworked thread that she wove in quick, rough rows between the legs of 2 shelving units, creating a windbreak that wouldn't hold against real weather, but might hold against the still, creeping cold of a sealed room. She crawled inside it and pressed her hands together under her arms and made herself breathe slowly. The second hour was harder. She had been trying not to think about the fact that Sarah had not looked back. Not once, in the entire walk to the library. Sarah had walked ahead of her and opened the door and stepped aside and not looked back, which was the behavior of someone who had already decided something and was no longer in conversation with their conscience about it. Frida had liked Sarah, had trusted her, in the way that you trust someone when you are far from home, and they are familiar and kind. It was not a large trust, but it had been there. The cold ticked on. Her breath fogged. She kept her hands pressed together. She was composing, in her head, a thorough analysis of which sigils she would put on the interior of her door when she got back to her room. If she got back. When she felt the latch move. It moved differently than she expected. Not the gradual lever movement of a key, but the sudden snap of something forced. Then the door swung open and cold air rushed through the gap. And in the gap stood the shape of a very large man holding a torch. The torchlight turned his eyes amber. She blinked. The amber shifted. She had registered it incorrectly, she thought, a trick of the flame. Because his eyes in the fuller light were gray, slate gray with undertones of silver. And they were fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately read. She was still sitting in her makeshift shelter, wrapped in her cloak, with 6 yards of rough woven thread surrounding her, like a very small, very inadequate fort. She watched him take this in. "I was working on a cold retention solution," she said, because the silence was getting long and she had been raised to be articulate under pressure. He looked at the thread, then at her, then at the thread again. "Come," he said. She stood. Her legs were less steady than she would have liked. Not unsteady, but with that particular quality of extremities that have been cold for too long. And she gathered her cloak and walked toward the door under her own power, because she was absolutely not going to be carried out of this room. She made it 6 steps before her left knee decided to demonstrate its disagreement with this plan. He caught her before she reached the floor. His hands were very warm. She registered that first, the warmth of them through the fabric of her sleeve, completely incongruous with everything else about this cold keep. And then she registered the scale of the man she was currently leaning against, which was considerable. She straightened up immediately. He let her. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said, which was not what she expected him to say. And then he did not say anything else, and she walked out of the library under her own power, with him at her shoulder the entire way. She was not present for what happened next. She learned it later, in pieces, from the way Finn's face changed when he reported back. Erik had sent for Sarah within the hour. Sarah had, by all accounts, confessed with impressive completeness, before anyone had done anything that required confessing to. The name she gave, Mara, the Countess, Erik's former, had produced a silence from Erik that Finn described as the kind that precedes bad weather. What Frida knew in the immediate aftermath was a fire in her room, finally. Dry clothes, a cup of something hot that tasted of barley and dried herbs, left outside her door on a tray with no note. She sat in front of the fire and let the warmth work its way back into her fingers, and thought about the look on his face. Gray eyes in torchlight, an expression she still couldn't name. Not concern exactly, but something with a similar gravity. She was still thinking about it when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. They stopped at her door. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They moved on. In the morning, there was something new on her door handle. A length of wool, thick and tightly spun, the color of charcoal. The kind that retains heat even when damp. The kind that was made in the northern style, for northern winters. She stood in her doorway holding it for a moment. There was no note. There was no need for one. She went back inside and added it to her supply of working materials. She was practical. She was a tool. She used it to line the next threshold weaving she made, tucked in the innermost layer, where only she would know it was there. She had a habit of working by moonlight. It had started in childhood, when her mother caught her up past midnight with a candle and a half-finished piece, and instead of sending her back to bed, had sat down across from her with her own work and said, "Some things want to be made in the quiet." Since then, Frida had developed a particular appreciation for the quality of light at the edge of dark. Not quite night, not quite day. The brief window when the moon was high enough to illuminate without blinding. The balcony off the Upper East Corridor had a stone railing worn smooth on top, and a view of the mountains that she would not have described as beautiful, because beautiful implied gentleness, and there was nothing gentle about those peaks. Severe, she thought. Conclusive. She was watching them and working at the same time. A practice warp. Nothing specific, just her hands moving through familiar pattern to keep them from freezing. When she heard the first movement from the shadows. She didn't hear the bow. What she understood afterward, reconstructing it, there had been a figure on the roof of the secondary wing. There had been a bowstring. There had been, crossing 30 yards of open air in less time than it takes to register the concept, a bolt wrapped in cloth, soaked in something that smelled of bitter oleander. What she understood in the moment was different. In the moment, there was a sudden large warmth at her back. A body, much larger than hers, moving in from her left with a speed that seemed physically implausible. And then a sound she had never heard before and hoped not to hear again. The particular flat thud of a point meeting flesh. She turned. He was standing behind her, very close, with his left hand still curved around her shoulder where he had pulled her back. His right arm hung loose. The arrow had gone through the upper right of his back, beneath the shoulder blade, and out through the front of his shoulder. She could see the head of it, black iron, half visible at the front of his shirt. He looked at it, then at her. "Inside," he said. "You've been inside." She went inside. He locked the door behind them, and then crossed the room in 8 strides despite the arrow in his shoulder, and did something very fast and violent with the shadows beyond the window that she was deliberately not watching because she had a pragmatic nature and had decided to use the time to find her medicine box. She found it on the 3rd shelf of her working chest, where she kept the traveling kit her mother had packed for her. "You'll be in the north," her mother had said, "and you don't know what they have." And her mother had been right about most things. When he came back in, he was holding the arrow in his other hand, which meant he had already done something about it that she was going to disagree with. She looked at the hole in his shoulder, then at the arrow, then at his face. "Sit down," she said. "It's sit down." He sat. It was possible this surprised him. It was very slightly possible it surprised her, too. He was not, she discovered, a cooperative patient. He sat in the chair because she had told him to, and he stayed in the chair because she was positioned between him and the door, and he did not make a sound through any of it, which should have been reassuring and was instead unsettling in the particular way of things that are being controlled by will rather than absence of sensation. "This is going to need to be cleaned first," she said, laying out her supplies on the nearest flat surface. Yarrow, which staunched bleeding, meadowsweet, which reduced the fever that often followed iron wounds, a strip of clean linen that she had been keeping for warping purposes and was now repurposing. The oleander residue on the arrowhead. "You know oleander?" She glanced up. He was watching her hands, not her face. "Weavers work with dye plants. Oleander is a common mordant in certain southern dyeing traditions. Also a paralytic toxin when concentrated. But the amount on a single arrowhead won't be enough to do more than make the wound inflamed and slow to heal. She settled the first linen pad against the entry wound. Hold still. He held still. She had cleaned wounds before, her brothers, her apprentices, once a particularly obstinate horse that had gotten a fence spike through its flank. But she had not done it under these precise conditions before, which were small room, firelight, a man 6 inches taller than anyone she'd grown up with, sitting very still and watching her hands with the focused attention of someone who was running low on things to do with their concentration. She worked in silence. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had picked up. When she reached for the yarrow compress, the back of her hand brushed the inside of his wrist, just above the pulse point. She felt his breath change, a slight catch, almost imperceptible. She did not look up. She applied the compress. "The arrow was meant for you," he said. "I'd gathered that. Blackfang. They know the treaty depends on you being alive." Mara gave them access. She pressed the compress flat, held it. And Mara gave Sarah the instructions for the library. "Yes. She's been systematically trying to kill me since I arrived." "Yes." Frida considered this for a moment. "She must find me very threatening," she said finally, with perfect neutrality. Something moved in his face. It was very brief, and she almost missed it. And she couldn't have said what it was. "She's been dealt with," he said. Frida began wrapping the linen binding, working from the back of his shoulder around and across. This required her to lean close, closer than she had been, close enough to hear the controlled evenness of his breathing and feel the warmth radiating off his skin, which was considerable, the particular heat of a body working hard to manage something. "The toxin will cause fever tonight," she said. "Mild. Drink the barley water. Stay warm. Don't—" She pulled the binding snug and heard him exhale. "Don't do anything that requires your right arm for 2 days. 2 days is non-negotiable," she said. Silence. She was tying the final knot, her fingers working close to his collarbone, when she became aware that he had stopped watching her hands and was watching her face instead. She did not look up. She made the knot perfect, pulled it firm. "Why?" he asked. She looked up. His eyes, in the firelight, were not gray. They were silver, completely silver, reflective as still water. And she realized she was seeing what the protection weaving had registered that first day, the quality that lived in him underneath the surface he showed everyone else. And it was not small. "Why what?" she asked. "Why take care with it?" He meant the bandaging. He meant, she thought, more than the bandaging. She held his gaze for a moment. His were very steady and warmer than she had expected, and she thought about the wool on the door handle and about the footsteps that had stopped outside her room and then continued, and about, "I don't have a mate, I have a treaty," and all the things underneath that sentence that a woman who had spent 10 years reading things woven into thread might or might not choose to unravel. "Because you bled for me," she said simply, "and I don't waste things of value." The fire popped. His expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, at the edges only, where the silver of his eyes met the shadows. The knock at the door was Finn's. 3 raps, urgent, and then his voice through the wood. "My lord, the council." Immediately. Erik stood. He moved to the door without looking at her again, which she noted, and which she chose to spend no time analyzing. But at the threshold, without pausing, without turning, his right hand, the bandaged shoulder's side, the one he had been holding still all evening, rose and touched the top of her head. Light. Brief, like he had not meant to do it, or had meant to do it very quietly, as though gentleness was something he was practicing in secret. Then he was gone, and the door was closed, and Frida sat in the firelight with her hands in her lap and the smell of yarrow and meadowsweet around her, and made no decisions and thought nothing she was prepared to name. The council meeting lasted 3 hours. She knew because she counted the bells. She didn't sleep. She worked instead, finished the secondary linen compress she had started before the interruption, Made a second one in case the fever ran high enough to require changing. Practical. She was very practical. The Countess Mara, she gathered from what she had overheard and what she could infer, had argued that the assassination attempt proved Frida was a liability, a target. The council had agreed, or enough of them had agreed, or enough of them had agreed loudly enough to matter. She was still awake and working when she heard the knock. Not Finn's 3-rap knock. 1 knock, then nothing. She went to the door. He was standing in the corridor with his coat undone and a tension in his jaw that suggested the last 3 hours had not gone as he would have preferred. His right shoulder was held slightly wrong. She clocked it immediately, the way he was favoring it without acknowledging that he was favoring it. "Fever?" she asked. "Low. The compress, I changed it." He looked at her for a moment. "I came because there are things you should know before the council acts." She stepped back from the door. He came in. He did not sit at first. He stood in the center of the room like he was accustomed to spaces being organized around him and was uncertain what to do in a space that wasn't, her spinning frame and drying thread and half-finished projects making the room specifically, narrowly, hers. Then he sat, because the alternative was continuing to stand in the middle of her thread, and sat with the particular controlled care of someone whose shoulder was making sitting uncomfortable. "Let me check the binding first," she said. "It's fine. I'll be the judge of that." He looked at her, then, without comment, turned slightly to give her access. She checked the binding. It had held. The fever was there in the skin around the wound. She could feel it through the linen, but not severe. She replaced the outer layer with the fresh compress. "The council wants to return me to Veldoria," she said while she worked. "Yes. Do you agree with them?" Silence. Long enough that she looked up at his profile. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the fire. "No," he said finally. "But they'll argue the treaty can be renegotiated without—" He stopped. Started again, differently. "You heard me. In the corridor. The first day." It was not a question. She had learned he used statements this way, as questions that he had decided were too important to phrase tentatively. "Yes," she said. "Then you already know what I said." He was still watching the fire. "And you stayed." "I had a job to do." "You stayed," he repeated, as though she hadn't spoken. "And you didn't ask questions. And you worked harder than anyone I've seen work in this keep. Because if I was going to be used, I chose to be used on my terms." She pulled the last strip of linen taut and knotted it. "Your alpha said I was a tool. Tools don't get to have feelings about it. But they do get to determine how sharp they are." He was quiet for so long that she began to fold up the remaining supplies. "My family carries a curse," he said. She went still. "The Ashveil line. Every alpha of our blood, from the 5th generation onward, after the first alpha broke a binding oath. The heart closes. Gradually, not metaphorically. The ability to bond, to form genuine connection, to feel things that aren't pack instinct. It freezes over, year by year. Some go faster than others. My father was gone by 40. He paused. I've been preparing for the same." She set down the linen she was folding. "The only thing that stops it," he continued, in a voice that had stripped itself of everything except the information, "is a mate bond. The bond of a destined pair, not a chosen one. You can't choose it. It either exists or it doesn't. And if it does—" Another pause, this one longer. "It announces itself." Frida thought about the ribbon of silver-blue light running through her protection weaving, about the warmth of his hands in a cold library, about the wool on her door handle at dawn with no note. "The morning you arrived," he said, "the spool of thread in the center of my chest began to unspool." He turned and looked at her directly for the first time tonight, and his eyes were the silver she had seen in the firelight 2 hours ago. wide open, nothing controlled about them. And I said what I said in that corridor because if the pack knew, if Mara knew, before I understood what was happening, before you had any protection. He stopped. You were protecting me, she said slowly, by calling me a tool. I was protecting you by making sure you seemed worthless to everyone who might want to leverage you. His voice had roughened at the edges. I am aware of how it sounded. She looked at him for a long time. There is a particular experience of having a thing you had decided about a person turn out to be wrong. Not a comfortable experience exactly, but an expanding one. The sensation of a room you thought you knew turning out to have another door in it. She had decided he was cold. She had decided this with good reason and reasonable evidence. And yet, here was another door. You were afraid, she said. Not accusatory, just accurate. Something moved across his face, caught off guard, or as near to it as she suspected he ever got. I was. Of the pack. He held her gaze. Of losing you to them. A long pause. Before I'd understood what to do about you. The fire between them crackled. The wind outside had settled into a low, steady pressure against the stones. She stood, slowly, and crossed to where he sat, and placed her palm against his chest, the uninjured side, over the heartbeat, in the same motion she had used to check his bandage, but not for that reason, and they both knew it. She felt his heartbeat. It was very steady, and under her hand, very warm. Ellie. His voice was low, and it was the first time anyone in this keep had said her name like it was something they'd chosen. He bent his head. His forehead rested against the top of her hair. They stayed like that for a breath. 2. The door crashed open. Finn, white-faced. She's called an assembly. Mara! Full pack, right now. He took in the scene. Frida's hand on Erik's chest, Erik's forehead in her hair, the quality of the air in the room, and his expression did something complicated. She says she has proof. The great hall held the whole pack. Frida had not seen them all assembled before. She had not quite understood, in the abstract, what the whole pack meant. She had been thinking in terms of a village, perhaps a few hundred people, something manageable. But the Ashvale wolves filled the hall from wall to wall and up the gallery stairs. And the collective weight of that many people, who shared blood and instinct and history, pressed against her like a physical thing. She walked in without Erik beside her. This was deliberate. She could feel the questions in the crowd, the way you feel weather through stone. Not the specific words, but the pressure of them. She walked to the center of the hall and stood in the open space Mara had arranged, and she held her wooden box under her arm, and she looked at Mara on the raised dais with the bright, uncrowded attention she usually reserved for flawed work. Mara was dressed for a verdict. She was very beautiful in the way of things that are designed to be looked at, precisely arranged, every detail calculated. And she was afraid, which Frida could see in the set of her shoulders, and the way her hands were very carefully still. The weavings this woman has placed throughout the keep, Mara said, her voice carrying beautifully through the stone acoustics, are not protection sigils. They are manipulation wards. Specifically, the Valdoria scripts for psychological influence, known in the Southern tradition as mind-touching, which works through repeated proximity to. They are traditional Valdoria foundation wards, Frida said, into the pause. The hall shifted. Heads turned. She set her wooden box on the floor and opened it. Inside, every tool she carried, the full set, spread in their organized rows. Her reference scripts, her thread samples, the personal stamp she used to authenticate her work. Every symbol I've used is documented in the Valdoria Weaver's Codex, which is publicly available at the Southern Library in Trenthal. She reached into the box and withdrew a folded paper, her working reference, annotated in her own hand. This is my working copy. Anyone in this hall who reads Old Valdorian script is welcome to verify it against any of the installed work. Silence. She looked out at the crowd. No one came forward. The knowledge of Old Veldorian was, by her assessment, essentially exclusive to weavers trained in the Southern tradition, none of whom were in this hall. "That's the problem, isn't it?" she said, and her voice was very calm. "You can't verify it because you can't read it, which also means you couldn't have verified it was harmful. Countess Mara, on what basis did you make this identification?" Mara's jaw tightened. "I have consulted sources." "What sources?" The hall was very quiet. Then, from the back, the sound of boots on stone, deliberate, unhurried. He walked through the crowd the way water moves through stone, not forcefully, but as though the space was always going to open for him. He came to stand before the dais, and he looked at Mara for a long moment, and then he removed his coat. She had not seen him without the outer layer before. He was built the way the mountains outside were built, not for aesthetics, for endurance, and across the right side of his neck and shoulder, visible now in the torchlight, was a mark she had not seen before. It looked like a burn, or like frost, a shape that was between a rune and a natural form, branching like ice crystals, or like the root system of something old and deep. It lay across the skin of his neck and was still, faintly, luminescent. Silver gold in the torchlight, pulsing very slightly, the same rhythm as a heartbeat. She had, objectively, read about bond marks. She had not, quite, believed in them the way you believe in things you have not seen. The hall had gone absolutely silent. Finn's voice, from the side, was pitched to Carrie. "The Alpha's bond mark, which forms when a mate bond is accepted and cannot be replicated by any known craft, and cannot be caused by external influence. Anyone present who would like to argue that a woman with a box of thread somehow produced this, please step forward." No one stepped forward. Mara's voice, thinner now. "The law of the pack states the Alpha's mate must be of wolf blood. This woman is human." The law also states," Erik said, and his voice was the first thing she had heard from him in this scene, very quiet and very complete, "that a curse-bearer whose bond forms outside the pack's bloodline may choose his own terms, because the curse itself is the deviation from law." He turned and looked at the assembled elders. "You all know this. You've known it since before I was born. You chose not to speak of it in the hope that the question would not arise." Finn produced documents. Finn had apparently been very busy. Mara looked at the documents, then at Erik. The careful arrangement of her expression was, for the first time, somewhat disarranged. "Who brought the Black Fang thief into this keep?" Erik asked. The most dangerous kind of quiet. Mara said nothing. "The records of her correspondence were retrieved from her rooms this morning," Finn said. "I have them here." The hall shifted again, a collective inhale, a pack recalibrating. Mara stepped down from the dais, slowly, because the alternative was being escorted. Two of the senior pack members moved to flank her, and she went between them with her chin high and her hands very still. And Frida watched her go and thought, afraid, from the beginning, and felt nothing except a flat, clear pity. Then she became aware that Erik had crossed to where she stood. He stopped in front of her. The hall around them was completely silent. Then, without warning, without ceremony, he knelt. Not as a performance. Not for the crowd. He knelt with the particular unhurried intention of someone who has decided on the thing and is doing it. And the hall watched, and none of them moved, because most of them had never seen him do anything that couldn't be described as choosing authority. He looked up at her. In his eyes, the silver had shifted, warmer, lit from within, like the bond mark on his neck, gold threading through the gray. "I have never asked anything of anyone," he said, and his voice was just for her, just the two of them in the center of all that watching. "I am asking now. Stay. Not because of the treaty, not because of the bond or the curse or any law this pact holds. A pause, and she could see the cost of the next words in the set of his shoulders. "Because I don't know how to be what I should be without you here, and I have known it since before I had a word for it." The hall breathed. Frida looked at him for a long moment. Then she did the only thing that made sense. She lowered herself to the floor in front of him, bringing them to the same level, and reached up and held his face in both her hands. His eyes closed for a single breath. She stood and turned and looked out at the assembled pack with the particular quality of attention that comes from 10 years of being the last person left working in a room and not caring who noticed. "I am staying," she said. "Anyone with questions may come to me individually. I am in the East Corridor most mornings." The first elder bowed his head, then the next. Then, like water finding its level, the rest. Spring arrived the way it always does in the north, not gently, but abruptly, as though winter had simply stopped trying. One morning the courtyard was ice and gray stone, and the next morning there were yellow flowers in every crack, insistent and small and completely unconcerned about whether the conditions were technically appropriate for them. Frida noticed them on her way to the East Corridor and stopped to look at one for a moment, thinking of Veldoria's gardens. Then she went inside and began her work. The weavings she made now were different. Not the tight, functional architecture of protection sigils. Those were done. The whole keep wrapped in layer after layer of soundcraft that would hold for 20 years at minimum. What she made now was something she hadn't made in a very long time. Personal work. Pattern for its own sake. The imagery of home, translated into a language this cold stone might begin to understand. Flowers from the south, olive branches, the stylized loom of her family's crest, rendered in the northern color palette. Black thread on undyed wool, restrained and honest. Members of the pack began to stop in the corridor to watch, at first from a distance, and then closer, with the cautious curiosity of people who had been told something was harmless, but were verifying this independently. She had not invited them. She did not discourage them. Finn started bringing her tea in the mornings without explanation. She accepted it without comment. These things, she thought, were happening on their own schedule, and the worst thing she could do was name them too early. She did not name the other thing either. That Erik had begun walking her East Corridor at an hour when there was no operational reason to walk it. That he had once sat on the floor 6 feet from her working frame and watched her work for 40 minutes before saying anything. And when he finally spoke, it had been about the structural composition of old Veldorian warding scripts, in a way that suggested he had spent time recently learning about them. That his eyes had shifted, not permanently, but in moments, in unguarded instants, from gray to that silver gold that meant the bond was present and awake. She did not name any of this. She wove it into the thread instead, one pattern at a time. The envoy from Veldoria arrived on a Wednesday, in rain. He was a young man she recognized, third secretary of her father's household, competent but nervous, with the particular look of someone given a message he did not write and is uncertain how to deliver. He had ridden hard, his horse was tired, and his coat was soaked. She was in the courtyard when he arrived, returning from the outer wall where she had been checking a warding that had been exposed to the spring thaw. She saw him before he saw her, and she saw the way his face did something quick and complicated when he recognized her. Relief first, and then something that wasn't quite dread, but was adjacent. She knew, before he said anything. "My Lady Frida." He came to her, formally, gloves in hand. "I bring word from Veldoria. Your father—" He paused, and the pause said everything. "Has passed. 3 weeks ago. Lord Davin requests your return for the morning observance." She heard the words, felt them go in. The courtyard was very quiet around her. The rain was steady and cold on her face. "When is the observance?" she asked, because asking practical questions was how she moved through necessary things. "As soon as you can arrive, my lady. Your brother—" Davin, 7 years her elder, always more her father's than hers, "has extended every—" That is, he wishes— I understand, she said. Thank you. I'll need 2 days to arrange my work and prepare for the journey. The envoy nodded, relieved to have something practical to respond to. She turned and went inside and up the east corridor and past her own room and to the end of the hall where the narrow stairs led to the roof. Erik was not there. She found him in the armory, which was where he went when he was working a problem with his body instead of his mind. Not sparring, but the repetitive, isolated work of maintaining weapons. Something with his hands, something that didn't require anyone else. He was at the far bench, back to her, and he stopped moving when she opened the door. She watched his shoulders. You heard, she said. He set down what he was holding. Finn told me. I need to go home. She heard herself say it, and it felt like 2 different sentences. I need to go, and home. And she was not certain which one she meant. For the morning, Davin needs, I know. His voice was flat in a way that was familiar now, the flatness that meant he was holding something back with some effort. Erik. He did not turn around. Erik, look at me. A long pause. Then he turned. His eyes were fully gold, not the mixed silver-gray she was used to, not the partial shift she'd seen in moments. Solid, deep gold, luminous in the dim armory light, and his face had the expression she had not seen on it before, the one she did not have a word for yet, the one that looked like a man standing in a doorway that is closing. She crossed the room. She stood in front of him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze, and she held it. I am going to come back, she said. He said nothing. I am going to observe my father's mourning and speak with my brother, and then I am going to come back. She paused. Do you understand? Still nothing. Something in his jaw. Say something, she said. Anything. His throat moved. Don't make promises that you haven't fully. I'm not making a promise. Her voice, to her own ears, was quieter than she meant it to be. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. Those are different things. He looked at her. The gold in his eyes had not dimmed. Then go, he said, very quietly. Do what you need to do. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she placed her hand flat on his chest, the same gesture she had used in the firelight that first night, over his heartbeat, deliberate, unambiguous. She felt it under her palm, steady and very fast. She turned and left, because if she didn't go now, she wasn't going to go tonight, and she had arrangements to make. She found him on the roof at midnight. She had not gone to sleep. She had packed and repacked and then sat in front of her fire for an hour, not working on anything, and then climbed the stairs in the dark because there was something unfinished, and she could not cross into Valdoria with something unfinished. He was standing at the northern parapet, looking at the peaks. His back was to her. The moon was high, and the snow on the distant mountains held it. Everything pale and precise and very cold. The kind of beauty that doesn't comfort. She went to stand beside him. They looked at the mountains together. The wind was low tonight, just a presence, moving her hair slightly. He didn't look at her. His hands on the parapet were very still. The silence went on long enough that she began to think he might not speak, and she was composing the beginning of something herself when he said it, quiet, nearly gone in the air. If there were no curse, no treaty, no bond. A pause. His hands did not move. If I were only a man, and you were only yourself, and none of this had happened the way it happened. Another pause. The longer kind. That meant he was deciding something. Would you have stayed? She looked at his profile. The line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the deliberate stillness of a man who is holding himself very carefully in place because he is afraid of the answer. She thought, all the wool on the door handle, all the footsteps that stopped and didn't knock, all the corridors you walked because I was in them. She thought, the first time you called me Ellie, your voice careful as thread through a needle. She slipped her hand into his on the parapet. His fingers closed around hers immediately, without thought, the response of something instinctive, older than decisions. He turned to look at her. His eyes in the moonlight were gold and silver both, shifting between them like the light on moving water. "I am going to observe my father's mourning," she said. "And then I am going to come back. Not because of you," she held his gaze, "because this is where I work best." She watched his face, watched the thing that moved through it. Not simple, not easy. Nothing in him was ever easy. But real, fully real, occupying him completely. "And," she added, "because I would like to see what happens next." His hand tightened around hers. They stood like that until the sky began to lighten. First the faintest suggestion of gray at the eastern edge, then something warmer, and the mountains catching it before the valley did, the snow going from blue-white to amber. Below them the keep stirred. First one sound, then two, then the accumulated noise of a day beginning. At some point he had put his cloak around her shoulders. She had not noticed when. She was aware of the warmth of him at her side, the steady pull of his hand in hers, the mountains turning gold by degrees. At the main gate of Ironveil Keep, the largest of her threshold weavings hung in the new morning light. From up here she could see the shape of it clearly, all the sigils, all the careful architecture she had laid in, layer by layer. And there, in the upper left corner, worked so small that you would not see it unless you knew what you were looking for. A single character in old Veldorian script. Not a ward, not a protection, not a charm against cold or malice or hostile intent. The word for home. She left on a Thursday, with a proper escort this time. 6 of Ashveil's riders, which had not been her idea, but which she had decided not to argue about. She did not cry at the gate. She was not a person who cried at gates. Finn handed her the traveling pack she had prepared, and looked at her with an expression that was, for Finn, practically sentimental. 2 weeks, he said, not a request. Approximately a request. 2 weeks, she agreed. She mounted. She did not look back immediately. There was no point in making something difficult on purpose, and she had a long ride ahead and a grief waiting at the end of it that she had not yet let herself fully feel. But at the tree line, where the north road curved and the keep would pass out of sight, she turned. He was at the gate, standing, not moving, watching. The morning light made his eyes impossible to read at this distance. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the road and rode. In the lining of her traveling cloak, pressed flat between the outer wool and the inner silk, was a piece of threshold cloth she had cut from her first day's work, the east corridor weaving, the one she had been pressing into the stone when she heard him say she is a tool. She had not taken it back. She had cut it free of the installation cleanly, with a weaver's precision, taking only her own work and leaving the adhesion intact. It was imperfect craft. You were not supposed to cut finished installation work. The sigils would be weakened at the cut edge, the protection only partial. But it was warm, and it smelled of Ironveil's particular cold mineral stone, and the torchlight in the east corridor, and faintly, very faintly, of the wool from a charcoal-colored length that had appeared on a door handle with no note. She pressed her hand over the place where it lay, through the layers of her cloak. Outside, the northern mountains rose and receded around her, doing what mountains do. Enduring, exact, unconcerned with the specific weight of the small things that move at their feet. She had 2 weeks. Then she was coming home. Here's your full closing narrative. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being useful, not the loneliness of being unseen, the loneliness of being seen only for what you can do, of arriving somewhere new and understanding before the gate has even closed behind you that no one in this place has thought to ask your name, that the question they are asking is not who are you, but what are you worth, and that they have already begun calculating the answer before you have set down your bag. Frida knew this loneliness. She carried it the way she carried her wooden box of thread, close to her chest, with both hands, not because it was precious, but because it was hers, and she had decided not to drop it. She came to Ironveil Keep as a treaty. A Weaver-scribe from the south, traded like a coin between two worlds that had never trusted each other. Valuable, yes, but valued the way a tool is valued. Useful, functional, replaceable the moment something more useful came along. She heard him say it herself, in a stone corridor on her first morning, his voice unhurried and certain. She is a tool. More useful than the standard dowry, but no different in nature. And she pressed the sigil flat against the stone and redid the last 3 knots, and kept working. This is the part of Frida's story that I want to sit with for a moment. Not the bond mark, not the assembly, not the moment he knelt before the entire pack and said her name like it was the only word that mattered. This part, this quiet, unglamorous, deeply human part. The choice to keep working when you have just been told, in plain language, that you do not matter. Because most of us will never have a bond mark appear on someone's skin to prove our worth. Most of us will not have a hall full of people watch someone kneel for us. What most of us will have, what most of us do have, is the moment in the corridor. The overheard conversation. The email CC'd without thought. The meeting you weren't invited to. The performance review that reduced 3 years of your life to a single paragraph of measured, bloodless language. And the question is not whether those moments happen. They will. The question is what you do with your hands while they are happening. Frida's answer was, keep working and be the sharpest thing in the room. She did not make herself smaller. She did not perform helplessness or beg for visibility. She did not wait for someone to notice her worth before she decided it herself. She took the terms she had been given, tool, treaty, useful thing, and she worked within them with such precision, such deliberateness, such refusal to be anything less than excellent, that the terms eventually became inadequate. The box they had built for her could not hold what she actually was. This is not a story about a woman who was rescued. This is a story about a woman who rescued herself. Quietly, methodically, one threshold weaving at a time. And then, when someone finally offered her a choice, was free enough to make it. And Erik. Let us talk about Erik, because he is not simply the love interest. He is a man carrying something inherited and heavy, a curse that closes the heart by degrees, a destiny written in someone else's handwriting, a lifetime of preparing to lose the ability to feel things that matter. He had built his walls before Frida arrived, not out of cruelty, out of survival, out of the specific, exhausting pragmatism of a person who has been told what they will become and has decided to manage it rather than fight it. Then she walked through his gate with a wooden box and steady hands and redid her knots in a cold corridor, while he stood around the corner, unable to say what he was already beginning to understand. There is something almost unbearably tender about that image, this large, controlled, authority-built man standing very still around a corner, already undone by something he hadn't agreed to feel yet, leaving wool on a door handle with no note because he does not yet have the language for what he wants to say. Walking corridors he has no operational reason to walk. Learning about Veldorian warding scripts in private, in whatever time he has left after running a pack and managing a curse and trying very hard not to need anyone. He is not a perfect man. He said something devastating about her in a hallway, and he knew she might have heard it. But, and this matters, he said it to protect her. Badly. Clumsily. In the only language he had available, which was the language of strategy rather than the language of care. Because the language of care was something he was still learning. And she saw that. She chose to see that. Not naively, not because she excused it, but because she was a woman who had spent 10 years reading things woven into thread, and she knew the difference between cruelty and fear wearing cruelty's clothes. This is the other lesson this story holds, quieter than the first. The people who are most afraid of needing you will often be the last ones to say so. And the question is not whether they deserve patience. The question is whether you have enough left to offer it after everything that's already been asked of you. Frida had enough. But she gave it on her terms. She never stopped being herself in order to make him comfortable. She never shrunk her work or her precision or her voice to fit into the shape of what a treaty bride was supposed to be. She expanded, and the keep expanded around her, and eventually the people in it began to bow their heads, not because she demanded it, but because she had simply continued to be exactly what she was, until there was no reasonable argument left for looking away. She left on a Thursday. She cried on nothing. She looked back once at the tree line where the road curved and the keep would pass out of sight, and she held his gaze across that distance and turned back to the road. In the lining of her cloak, a piece of threshold cloth, cut from her first day's work. Imperfect. You were not supposed to cut finished installation. The sigils weakened at the edge. The protection only partial. But it was warm, and it smelled of home. She had 2 weeks. Then she was coming back. This is what I want you to take from this story. You are not the terms others use to describe you. You are not the function you were brought in to serve. Your worth is not a number someone else calculated before you arrived. And it is not diminished by the fact that they were calculating. Keep working. Be precise. Weave the extra layer that no one asked for, because you know it matters. Leave the word for home in the corner where only you can see it. And when someone finally asks, not what you're worth, but who you are, you will already know the answer. You always did. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe and the bell. Your support is literally what keeps these videos alive. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know.